sense.
It does take a lot of process. I mean, this is something that really takes a long time to understand. So don't worry about if you don't understand it straight away. That's
so basically the first one is returning the world value.
Yes.
And basically the second part, what we are saying is, how does it become the input, the world?
Because when you return something from a successful callback on a promise, it will automatically be populated as a parameter for the next successful callback.
Got it.
Right. So I actually shouldn't have started with this. Let me show you. This will make a little bit more sense, right? So now I can, instead of this, I will do this. So promise resolve world. Okay, this is the other way to write it. So what we're saying is, we are inside of this promise, we have our world in here, and we're saying now resolve with this. Sorry, that should be written. Now resolve again with the name world, with the world, and then it will go to the second callback, and it will print out the world. See?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this might be a little bit more understandable. So the first promise, which is the foo, will resolve. It will go into this callback. Inside of that callback, we will resolve another promise, which then goes into this callback, and so on and so on. And you can chain it as much as you want. Now, if you return, that's considered as a promise.resolve. If you throw an error, or if you reject, then it would go into the second callback. So if I show you now, let's do a new promise. So we will say.
Funny, because the syntax is a bit confusing. When you look at it, you would think that the second promise, as it's not indented or
yes.
Not like the line, you would think it's at the same level as the first one. So that was my confusion at first.
And this is exactly right. And this is just the feature of promises. So that's just how it populates through the chain. I could take this and put it in here, and it's exactly the same thing. Right, and that's what I wrote to you in here.
Yeah.
Like, you can chain it this way.
Makes more sense. Yeah.
Right. So this actually makes sense, kind of. Yeah, when you look at it, it makes sense. But once you get more familiar with it, you would write it like this because this is just neater, right?
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah. So this thing is pretty much the same thing. The only thing I would say is, like, in here you're going inside and inside, so you might not have the access to like some variables that you would need or something like that. So there are different reasons why to actually write it like this, but one of them would be that it's just more readable. So if we go back, well, actually, let me just define new promise, and let's reject this time. So we will say promise dot reject some error. So now we created a promise. Don't worry about the red text for now. We created a promise that will reject. So this is a promise that was not successful. So for example, if you submit a request to the server, and for example you are offline, then the fetch will actually reject with some kind of error that will tell you that you are offline. So now if we do the same thing like we did before, so we call the promise and we say then, so something after the promise is done, and we would say the callback would be data console log data. So we say resolve data. So if I execute this, what would you expect to see?
Undefined, or no, I mean, this would be just for resolve, right? So
yeah,
you haven't defined what you do if it's a reject. So
exactly. So we used then, and we said what is going to happen when it's successful callback, but we didn't define anything to happen when it's reject. So if I execute this, it will show me this nasty console error, which is by default shown, but it doesn't do anything, that no logic basically. So if we add another callback in here, I will say function error. So now we are actually handling the error, and we say console log reject error. So if I execute this, you will see reject some error. So we got into this callback because that's the error callback, and we have this, the error parameter is this text which we defined basically what is the project rejected with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the syntax is you go .zen and then you put the function for the resolve, and then you put a comma and then function error.
Yes, you need to, if you want to handle only errors, you still will have to put the resolve, because it's just, you need to have two parameters in then.
Got it.
Okay, now there is a better way of writing it. The same way that we have then for success, we have catch for errors. So what you can do is you can say foo.catch, and you kind of can guess what this does. This will handle only errors. So you would do function error
Yeah, that looks neater.
Yeah, console log error, right? And if I execute it, you get the same result basically like we did before. Now this is definitely more preferred way of doing this, because, and you need to think about the application, which we will talk about in a minute, but this is a preferred way of doing it because it will look much better. So if we have a promise, let's create a new one actually. Let's just do oh no, so if we create new promise, and we will say this is actually, so I'll write a little bit more complicated promise. So resolve reject, I'll say if not random is more than 0.5, for example, hey, then resolve else. Right, so this is my new promise. Okay, what did I do there? Right, so this is my new promise. Now, actually, let me do it differently. Okay. Right, so what I did there, I defined a new function. This is a new function basically, and it will return a new promise, and that promise will take a random number. It will check if it's bigger than 0.5, so just to get some kind of randomization going on, and if it is, it will resolve. If it's not, it will reject. Okay, so now if we call this, let me just do it again. So now if we call this, what we can do is we can say then message, for example. Let me just write it out again. Here you go. So this is our successful callback. Right? And I can also add the unsuccessful callback in here. So this is one way of actually writing it. Right?
So you need to have this error parameter in your second line.
Yes. Don't get too hung up on the names of these parameters. They are just parameters. You can name them anything you want, right?
Okay.
But the parameter in here is what you will get from the actual promise. Okay. So now you see this one resolved with hooray. This one also resolved. Also resolved. This one rejected. Okay. So this is the way to handle two different scenarios. The same thing, I can write exactly the same thing. So let me just copy this in here so we don't lose it. Let me just remove this for a bit. So this is one way of writing it. The second way of writing it will be with the actual chaining of then and catch. So I can do foo, then, right? So this is my successful callback handling, and then I can do. Let me just put this on a new line, and then I can do catch function error. So I can write it like this as well. You see, it does exactly the same thing like this one. It's just written with then and catch. So it's using the chaining rather than the callbacks, if that makes any sense. So if I execute this, you had a resolve, 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 now reject again. Right? So it handles it the same way, basically. Does that make sense?
Yep. Very clear.
Let me copy it in here as well. Now, can somebody think, why do we have this two different ways of writing it? Like, what is the difference between them?
Between the first bit and the second bit, yeah?
Yeah, between these two. So these are callbacks, let's say, and this is the chaining, yeah?
There's no difference, isn't it? I mean, it's just
readability, I guess.
Sorry?
Is it just readability?
It's in well, it depends on the application. So mainly you would do it for readability if you have a simple promises, but there is one fundamental difference that you need to be aware of with this.
Okay, in the second one, the catch will handle errors. Let's say the line 14 will handle errors coming from before.
Yeah.
While line 4, it's going to be evaluated no matter what.
I think you are on the right track, but it's kind of slightly different. But basically, what you need to be aware of is that because you're doing one callback in here, whatever happens in the successful callback cannot affect what happens in the error callback, and vice versa. Okay. So these two callbacks, these two functions, they cannot affect each other. It will, when this promise finishes, one of them will get executed, and that's it. Does that make sense?
So you're saying in the second one?
Let's look at the second one later. Let's look at the second one in a second. But does it make sense that in here you execute promise, and then one of those will get executed, and that's it, right? Nothing else will get executed.
Yep.
Okay. So it will choose either to execute this one or this one. That's it. Now in the second one, because it's a chaining, it will always come to this catch, right? So when you first execute this then, if it's successful, there is a chance that in here something could happen, and then it would come to this catch. Okay, so for example, if I, and let me just, so I don't mess this up, if I take this and show you another, is this big enough for you guys, by the way, to read this, or do you want it bigger?
It's good for me.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. So in this case, now if I throw an error in, or if I do actually, let's do this, right? So if I do promise reject something, then, and I do the same in here, let me just do this one. Oh. Right, so now I updated both of them with the same thing. So in the successful return, I do a promise reject. Okay, so basically what I'm doing in here is I'm saying this promise will now reject instead of resolve. Okay, so now in the first example, what happens is the first one will resolve, it will go to the first successful callback, that one will reject, it will say, well, something went wrong, and that's it, right? There is nothing after that something would happen in there, because this callback will not get executed because it's either this one or this one. There is no chaining going on. So if the first one resolves, then only this one will be executed. If the first one rejects, only this one will be executed. While in the second example, in the first callback, if I return promise reject, this promise reject will be caught by the catch statement that we have in here, because it's going down in the chain. So basically, this is the first instruction. If that rejects, then it goes to the second instruction, and that will catch the error. So that's the fundamental difference between these two approaches. Now tell me if what doesn't make sense.
It does. Do you, in practice, do that sometimes? Like have a promise rejecting? Okay.
Yeah, so what can happen is that, and this actually happens quite often. You would encounter kind of two different kind of promises. One would be very straightforward, where you just have either success or error, and in that case you would use this kind of syntax. And because, as Ricardo said, like, it's more readable basically. If there is more complex promises, then you would very likely do kind of like a hybrid approach with these. So you would kind of chain them, because it really depends, because sometimes you don't want the catch to handle everything basically, or you might want to handle everything. So you might have a promise where you would have something like foo, and then you would go dot then, and then you would have catch. Right? And then if anything happens in any of these promises, then it would get caught by the last catch. So sometimes you will want that kind of scenario, which might be, for example, a validation or something like that. But sometimes you wouldn't want that to happen. So you would want to have kind of like an internal handling of error and external as well. So sometimes you might even end up with something like this. So you could have foo, then, and then you would have your result, right? And then in here you would have your error as well. So you would handle both resolve and reject of this promise inside of this then. But then you might want to have also dot catch in here, or even better, dot another then. That would do something, and then you could have a catch in here. Right? So now, what are we doing in here? We're executing this promise, and we're saying if it's successful, execute this function. If it's unsuccessful, execute this function. So if it resolves, execute this. If it doesn't resolve, execute that. Then we're saying if, and then we're saying then after this is handled, if there is a success after all this work, basically, if there is a success, then do this, and if there is an error, then do this, right? So you can, so basically, sometimes what this is useful for is if you want to, for example, silence errors. So if everything is successful, all good, continue, right? And if there is an error, you could say report and continue. So you can basically change this into a success rather than error. And then when you would come in here, you would go in both. So you would receive stuff from either. Okay. So you could use that, for example, to return something default. So if I show you, where's my console? So let's create a promise that would do that. So if we do we would say promise reject, something like this. So we have a promise that rejects now, and now what we will do is, oh, I shouldn't have that. Let's do that. So now if I call it and I say then that's just the result. Console log, correct result. Oh no, actually, let's just do so it's more visible. So we do return result. Okay, and then we do function error and say console log. That was an error for not default. Hey, come on. Console and return default. And then we would say then right. So if I have a promise like this, oh, actually I shouldn't have shown you. Wait, right. So if I have this kind of promise written out, what do you think is going to be the final data? And my promise is, let's do it. Let me just show you again. So the promise is this, and I will be executing this. So what do you think the result is going to be in the console? What will you see in the console?
So you have defined the result when it's rejection, the bad data. Let me say foo then function result, return result. function error. Console there was an error for the default. So my guess is you would get there was an error, fall back to default, but data, and then it returns default. So basically you would get then final data default.
What do you think, Ricardo? So this is what Thomas is saying, we will see. What do you think, Ricardo?
So the foo is getting the promise.
So the foo is defined in here.
Then, after it's execute, it should rush. It takes the result to the next function, which returns result. But it also runs the next function, but there's no error at that point. So nothing happens in there, or either that is not defined. And then the result of the two previous one, I mean from the result, it's going to run in the next then, and it's going to console out the data. Okay, the console out the data comes from the actual result in the first then.
You mean this one?
Yeah, I don't think it gets into the error at any point.
Why do you think it doesn't get to the error?
Because foo is, oh well, if rejecting makes it go to the error instead of going to result, then it's returning default. But what is default?
In this case, default is just as text, right?
Okay, so if it returns that text, then that text is what it's fitted in the console log as final data default.
So you think we will see final data default?
Yes.
What about you, Christina?
I think the same. It's return final data default.
Is the fact that default is a text, it no longer is a promise, then, or is there a trick there or something?
No, it's still a promise.
Got it. Okay.
So this is what you think?
Yeah.
Right. So one of you was right. If I execute this, you will see there was an error and final data default. So pretty much all of you are right, but you will also see this, right? So let's break it down again. We have a promise that is rejecting. So this promise is basically saying this promise has an error. Okay? When we do the first then, we go into successful callback. In this case, successful callback is no use because this project is rejecting. There is an error, so there is no success, right? So it goes to the next one, and the next one is the error handling, the error callback, reject callback. So this is what actually is going to happen. Now the first line, console log, right? So that's why we see this message. The bad data, where does that come from? That's come from error. Error comes from the parameter in the actual callback, which is basically what we are rejecting with. And then the next line, it returns default. Now, if you remember what I said before, if you return inside of this handling, that basically suggests that the next step is successful. If you return any value within this first handle of then, doesn't matter if it's in an error callback or resolve callback, it will continue as a resolve. Okay. If you want to continue as an error, you will have to throw an exception, or you will have to do another promise reject. That's the only way not to break the promise chain. So in this case, we just return, which basically means we are returning successful value. Then we're doing another then, and we just print out the value. So this function, as you see it in here, is being used in the production quite a lot, and it basically what it does is it will handle success, which if it's successful, it will just return the successful value, nothing done to it. If it's an error, it will log something out somewhere, and it will return a default value. So in your flow in your application, if you think about it, you might not want to go to the way of errors, right? You might want to have an application where you care about either successful value or the default value. You don't want to show any error values. So this is exactly what this would be used for. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Now we could rewrite this. You can play with this as much as you want. We could rewrite this to just use then and catch, right? So we could take this whole thing and we could actually put catch in there. So we could do, dot catch in here and handle it that way. But I would advise against it. I think that catch should always be at the end, and just you should catch the errors that way. So this would be much more readable. You basically it's kind of visible that you overturning the error basically. So if I show you just so you see that I'm not joking. If I take this and I redefine it, so if I say the promise now resolves with hello world, right? So that's our new that's our new promise. So foo now resolves with hello world. When we call the same command, the same function, we will see final data hello world instead of final data default, because it went to the successful callback and it just returned straight away, and it went down to the last then, to the next then. If you forget about returning the result, so if I do this, what would you see now in the console? What do you think? So our promise now is promise resolve hello world. What would we see now in the config? In the console.
Just foo.
Promise resolve. I can write it like this. That's probably better. Oh, sorry. No. Right. So Thomas is saying we will see foo in the console. Any other ideas? Ricardo? No? Christina? What do you think we will see in the console in this case?
I don't know.
Let's walk through it.
Probably foo and final data foo again.
So you're saying that we will see foo and then final data and foo.
Yes.
Okay. Thomas said that we will just see foo.
The result.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the then is still running after evaluating the previous then,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's just.
and it's
not
still
returning anything.
consoling logged out. It's consoling out the final data
And what?
plus
Yeah.
what it took from before, which was the result of the previous then, which is foo.
So you're saying that this data will be
Right.
foo.
So to me, yeah, to me it's gonna be because that's what is coming from the previous then.
What do you think, Thomas?
Well,
Result
it's not a return.
then.
To me, the first return there is no. Sorry, the first then there is no return. So I don't know if console log actually automatically returns something or if it's just gonna be nothing. to
Well, yeah,
return,
there's no
so just
return
foo
in
and then-
there.
Yeah. So there is no return in there. Sorry, Christina, did you say something?
I know.
So there is no return in here. So nothing is going to be passed down here.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But
Okay.
Ricardo was also right. So Thomas was right in this one, and Ricardo was right in this one. That this then is still going to be executed, right? So what you will see in the console will be foo from the first one, and then you will see final data undefined. Right? See? Tell me if it's
And
confusing.
the whole point of this is because that we are going over this because of the asynchronous modularity of JavaScript, where we have to code based on information that is not made available yet.
Yeah.
So the actual engine will eventually wait until that data is made available to keep going instead of just breaking. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah, that's the point of promises, yes.
And then async await is just a different syntax to accomplish the same concept, basically.
It is very similar, but you cannot always write the same thing with async await like you could with promise and vice versa. Right? So both the syntaxes, you can most of the time you can choose which syntax you use, but sometimes you will want to do the chain instead of doing async await. And promise can do more things as well. So there is, I mean, later when you explore promises more, there is, for example, there is promise all, right? And this will take a list of promises. So you can give it as many promises as you want. And then
Yeah, this all makes sense.
Yeah, this was one of the exercises we did.
right, so you do something like this, for example.
Sorry, just Thomas, can you please not delete the page because I had a question on the first on the previous exercise, but please carry on.
Yeah, so you see, like, you can, so promise, for example, has .all, so you can add as many promises as you want, and when you execute it, this promise, this return, so basically you do then as you normally would in here, and you will not get here until all of these are done, right? You cannot do that with async await. With async await, you have to kind of go line by line. There is nothing that can group these promises, basically. So there are some things that each syntax, is good for, but most of the time you can achieve the same thing with either. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
There is, so I feel like, you know, there is a little bit of open questions for you guys about like asynchronous programming in general. So, you know, if you have any questions, just ask me, because it's very important that you understand how it works in JavaScript and why it works that way. And then you should know about callbacks, you should know about promises, and you should know about async await. You need to know these three concepts for asynchronous programming. So definitely ask me if you need anything. Thomas.
Yeah,
what,
I mean,
yeah.
async await. I mean, first maybe this question on the final data that we just cleared. So I understand console log foo does not return anything. So
Yeah.
basically, the second bar then function data. As it's not a resolve, why is it still doing the console log final data? I thought it would just go straight to undefined because we haven't catered for the non-resolve part, right? Oh no, it is it. I'm just trying to understand, like,
Yeah.
as the first bit is a promise. Well, yeah, okay, it is actually a promise. I have the response to my question. Actually, yeah, okay, got it.
Yeah.
It is a promise, so it actually says final data, but as there's no return, it just says undefined. Okay, got it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So remember that then and catch, they keep chaining the promise. You can chain as much as you want the promise, and you will always get to the next one.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then async await. I was kind of just using it all in my exercises as a kind of a, you know, without really understanding how it works, because I thought this kind of, you have to have the async await with the promise. Is that a fair way to think about this, or you know that you need to have your async await in your function whereby you have a promise? Is that...
You can use them together if you want to. It doesn't really matter that much, but basically you can, with async await, you can take an asynchronous function and you can write it in a synchronous way, even though it's still asynchronous. So for example, if I create a async function, it's from different language. If I create the async function foo, right, and this now needs to return a promise or something, right? So this will return a promise, and that promise will resolve, for example.
So this wouldn't work if you didn't have the async, for example.
Yeah. So in this case, we're saying this is a asynchronous function and it will return a promise. Okay. Oh, actually, you need to use the async if you're actually using something some away. So you could still have this. Let me just simplify it even more. So you have function foo, and that returns a promise. Okay, and then you use it. So you could say I have function bar, and I want to use function foo inside of it. Right? So you have two options. You can do foo dot, and then you would do then and dot catch to do something, right? So for example, if we do very quickly, by the way, before we move on with this, do you guys understand the difference? I mean, are you comfortable with the difference between this first example and just doing the shorthand version of this, like that? Are you
so you mean with the fat arrow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're okay with that? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna use that because there is no point writing it all out like this. So we can have then, and we can say data console log success data. Okay, and then we can have error console log error data. Right, so this is my So this is one way of writing it. So this is without async await,
Oh, maybe you need to put data in your error. Exactly.
Yeah. So this is without async await, right? So you can have a function that calls this function which returns a promise, and then you just handle the promise. With async await, you could write it like this. So you said bar, and you could say, well, if you want to catch the errors as well, you would have to do try and error. I don't know if you try and catch. Sorry, I don't know if you have seen that before. But this is basically the same syntax like for the promises, but for async. So you would do try, and then you would do foo. You would execute the foo, and you would basically get the data, like you would normally do in a synchronous programming, basically. So just on one line, and then you would log out the data. If anything within this try block throws an error, you would just do console log error. So just to have the same result, we would do success and error. So this is exactly the same thing written two different ways. Does it make sense?
Got it. Okay, so the async await is actually used in a different. Well, it's basically doing the same thing, but you don't use it in the first bit. Okay.
I like it. Just
I'm glad you like it. Yeah, so I like this one more as well, to be honest. Yeah, so the kind of advantage of async await is that you can write asynchronous code synchronously, basically line by line. You don't have to have all this .then, and then you could have like a more structure inside of this, and it would kind of keep going in a tree. While in here you can write it asynchronously. Synchronously. But obviously, sometimes it has some disadvantages as well, because, for example, if I now want to handle two errors inside of here, we might have to have another try and catch. So if this is my first action, and then I want to do another one, then I would have to do try and catch again, for example. And then I could do again like another one in here, or whatever, something like that. So in that case, it would be easier to write it with promises, because you can chain them and you can make it look nice. In this case, this would be pretty horrendous. So it really depends on your application, what you do at that particular moment, if you want to choose async await. Does it make sense? Somehow? Yeah. Don't worry about it. Like, you will practice more, and you will be able to choose which one is the best and stuff. But as long as it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christina, are you happy with that?
Yeah.
So you said, let's go back to this one, Christina. You said you didn't understand this one, right?
Yeah.
So let's go through it line by line. So this is our example. So do you understand this first line? What does it do?
So it's returned for us foo, right?
So this first line, what does it do?
Return.
This first line will return a promise that is resolved. That means it's successful.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is basically some kind of asynchronous action that is successful, and the data from the successful action is hello world. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't make sense? Yeah. So then the next one, what is this?
And then function return for us foo.
Right. So the first line here is that dot then. So what does this mean, this dot then?
It means like the then return for us something.
Yeah, so
Right.
dot then is literally you saying we have this promise, and after the promise finishes, do something.
Yeah, do
Okay,
something.
yeah, so dot then, so after it finishes, do something. Now this first function that you see in here is the first parameter of this dot then function, and the dot then accepts two parameters. One, oh, actually you can see in here. One is if it was successful, do something. The second one, if it was not successful, do something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, if it was successful, you're gonna give it some kind of callback, which is a function, and it's gonna be called with whatever the data was resolved from the promise. So if you think about it, this result at this point, this result is this hello world.
Okay.
Okay, does it make sense?
Yeah.
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 The second callback is the function error. So this means if the promise was not successful, then it will execute this. It will not execute this one, the successful one. It will execute only the unsuccessful one, the reject callback. And at that point, the error would be whatever is in here again. So if I change this to reject instead of resolve, then this will be executed and the error will be hello world. Okay. It depends on what this promise does. Then it depends which one of these is going to be executed.
Okay, but why it return after that then function data?
Yes.
Why?
So let's go further. So now we know that this one will resolve. So that means it will execute the first callback. The result at this point is hello world. What do we do inside this function? Let me just space it out a little bit. So what do we do inside of this function? So
what you mean?
Here we have the beginning of the function. Here is the end of the function. What do we actually do inside of the function?
We just return hello world.
Where do we return hello world? Which line number?
104.
104.
Yeah, we return hello world.
But in here is nothing on line 104.
I mean the function 102, 103 line.
Yeah.
It will be returned for us hello world. As a result.
The function 102 will return a promise for you. Okay.
Yeah.
On line 103, we take that promise and we say after the promise is finished, here is the successful callback and here is the reject callback. Okay. So at this point, so in here, with this then, this is all synchronous. We're saying to the computer, here is the promise, it will resolve, and then I want to do something. Whatever happens after here, this is already asynchronous. You don't know when this is going to happen, right? Sometime in the future. So you're basically just writing the syntax for it to actually be executed sometimes in the future. Now, the successful callback in here, what it does, inside of between those two curly brackets, which is the body of the function, it will console log, it will log something in the console, and the something is foo. Right? So once this is actually resolved, it will come in here and it will say foo. Yeah? Does it make sense?
So when we use console log, we will have hello world foo.
The hello world is inside of this result.
Okay.
Yes. And you see this result right now is just a parameter. Inside of this function, we don't do actually anything with the result.
So I guess, Christina, if you had console log foo and then a comma and then results, then you would have hello world. You would have foo hello world.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you write it like this, you would have the hello world in there. But because we don't, we actually don't use this, right? We don't use this hello world anywhere.
Okay. Console log is just string.
Yeah. So you just console log foo. Okay. Now this one, will this be executed? This function error?
No, because if it's executed, it should be not resolve. It should be
Reject.
Yeah, reject.
Perfect. Yes. So this will not be executed. Okay. So that's, we are done with this first .then. Okay. So we know that after this promise is done, we go to .then. We will execute this one. Sorry. We will execute this one because it's the successful. Because it's a successful callback, and we will not execute this one because this is the error callback. And we are done with the first then block. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we are chaining, so basically we are saying I want to do something again after this promise is done, right? And basically what this means is I want to do something after this promise is done, after this first callback is done. Okay, and then I'm saying, okay, so this is step 1, this is step 2. Once you get to this step, it has exactly the same syntax. It has exactly the same blueprint. You give it you can give it 2 callbacks or just 1 if you want to, like in this case. And we're saying if everything before, so in here we're saying if everything before, so that means anything above this, if it was all successful, then I want to execute this function. And this function has a parameter data, and the data is whatever the result of this is. Okay.
So data, it can return for us result and can return error, right?
Yeah, if we choose to, yeah, we could, yeah. So in this case, when it's resolved, the application goes here, right? So it will create the promise. Then it will come in here because it is successful. It will console log the foo, right? And then it will jump. It will not execute this one, and it will jump down to here because it's, again, we are in the successful flow. And at this point, you can see in here, at no point in the first step, which is this, did we return anything, right? There is, you don't see return anywhere in here, right? So that means that the second step will have no data because we didn't return anything. Okay, so you need to remember that the chain of the promise does not kind of magically remember what the first result was. Okay, it will take whatever the return, so whatever the return or result from the previous one is, and in this case we don't have any in here. So when you come in here, this data is undefined because there is nothing returned in here because it jumped, so it went 1, 2, 3, and it jumped in here 4. And you see that at no point in 1, 2, 3 there is a return, right? Well, especially the most important one is the 3, but there is no return in here. So it comes in here and it goes 4, and it will console log. So it will console log final data is undefined because we didn't return anything in here. So now, if we want this hello world in here, what do we need to do?
We need to have need to add a return there.
Where? Here?
After the result.
Sorry, where?
No. Maybe it should be reject, promise.reject.
We will do reject in a second, but if we want to take the hello world from the resolve and have it in here in the data, then what do we need to do in here? So if you look at the steps, right, how it goes, what would you have to do so this data actually has something in it? Well, you were right. You just need to finish the sentence, basically.
So promise dot reject, right?
So
and
if
then okay, sorry, it returned for us error function.
Yeah, so this is the error function that's not being used now because we are resolve, right? So the steps are here, we create the promise, then here we go through the successful flow of the promise, then we console log something in here, and we jump here, and at this point data is not there because the first step, which is this, they didn't return anything. So if we want to actually get the hello world to here, we will have to add a return in here.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the in the first step we define the promise. In the second one, the resolve of the promise is now stored in this result. And if we want to push it down, like further in our flow, we need to return it again, so the next piece of code can use it.
Okay.
Okay. The same way, you don't have to return the result. You could just say, Thomas in here, or Peter, whatever, in here, and then this data would be a Peter. Whatever you return from the first step would be as a data in the second one.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Does it somehow make sense?
Yeah, we just add string, right, when return, so we can add any string and get in data.
Yes, it can be anything. You can return anything from here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And we can, like I just show you that you can put whatever string you want in there, but most likely would put result, which basically takes the first string, which was originally this.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you
so
much.
Now let's go through the other one. So now we do the reject. Okay. So first step again, we create the promise. So now what is going to happen next? So
we get there was an error, fall back to default.
So we will go here, yeah?
Yeah.
So this is our second step. So already, remember, this is a reject, so it's not successful. So this first callback, which is the successful callback, will be ignored because it was not successful.
Yeah.
Yeah? So it will come to the second one. Now, what is this error at this point?
This param.
What is it? What's inside of it?
Our text.
Hello world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is it, because it was rejected with this reason. It's called reason, and that's stored now in here. Now the next step is this. So what's gonna happen here?
We will get result the text what we have there.
So this
error.
Yes. So this whole thing will appear in the console, right? And plus the hello world, because that's our error in here right now.
Yeah.
And the next step is, what is this?
So it return default, but what default means?
This is just a string. It means nothing. It's just a string.
Okay.
Yeah. So now you're returning something in here. So this is the last line. So you basically finish this whole step. Okay.
Yeah.
And now the program is going to be moving to the next one. And because we return here, you need to remember that if at any point in any callback you return, that means you basically saying now everything is successful. Whenever you return in a promise, that means it will handle it as a success. So it will go down to the then, right? So this will be our next step. And it will take the successful callback, not the error callback, because we returned. And it will come in here. The data at this point will be what?
Hello world.
No.
There was an error of this text.
No. So this is just in a console. That's not being stored anywhere. That just prints out in the console. But this data is what was returned from the previous step.
You mean error?
Yeah. So we're returning the string default.
So our data return for us a function error, right?
The data is just the string default.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you go to the error callback because it was not successful. The error at this point is hello world. That was what was it rejected with, the reason. And we don't actually do anything with the error. We just print it out on the screen, but we don't really do anything with it. Instead, we are returning the string default. And because we return something from this block, it will be received in this one. And then we just print it out into the console. It's quite confusing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But does it make at least a little bit sense?
Yeah, for me, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. What about you guys? Do you understand it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's I think the more we see it, the more we go through it, and the more we understand it. So
Yeah.
thank
Cool.
you.
Ricardo?
Yeah, exactly. Same as Thomas.
Okay, cool. So I mean, again, like, you know, this is really not an easy concept to grasp. So don't worry about it. Like, it's just practice makes masters. So that's promises. I should have been talking to you today about fetching. So honestly, fetch, you are using it anyway. So as Ricardo showed me. So basically, fetch is a function in a browser that you can use to get some data from the server, right? So from the backend. So you can do fetch. It has some kind of API where usually it's a URL. So for example, HTTP Google, right? Something, and then it has an object with some kind of options. You can find it. You can find all the documentation on MDN or anywhere else. So if you just do MDN fetch. Right, so in here somewhere, oh, that's the specification. So there will be somewhere documented everything that you can do with it. Using fetch. Right, so this is the thing that you kind of know. You do a fetch from a URL, and then you can process the data. Okay, so now you can obviously all these options are there, but you just need to think about which one do you want. So I want to talk to you quickly because we don't have much time left. So I want to talk to you quickly about this method. Do you know what method is for a request to the server, to the backend?
I don't know.
Okay, so basically, when you send a request to the server, what really happens is that you create a connection to the server, and you need to tell server what are your intentions, right? And in a kind of normal environment, and you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way because as developers develop applications on the server as well, they kind of choose whichever kind of patterns they want to follow and stuff. But in a normal environment, and for most of the HTTP servers, they will have implemented different methods. And by methods, we mean get, post, put, and delete. These are used to kind of distinguish different requests to the server, and different requests have different rules, right? There are rules about redirections, there are rules about caching, there are rules about the body of the request, and so on and so on. So each of those will have some kind of set of rules. These rules, they will differ from project to project, from server to server, because they are very much up to developers what they want to kind of implement. If everybody follows the correct kind of guidelines, then get would be to load something from the server, post would be to save something new, put would be to update something, and delete obviously would be to delete something, right? And when we say something, that usually means some kind of item, or what we call it, an entity. Okay, so if you think about it, and I think in here in the documentation we have something like books, sorry, in the presentation. So let's think about books, right? So if you want to get book, if you want to get information about a book, you would do a get, because you're just loading from the server. You are not actually changing anything on the server, you're just loading some kind of data. So that's your get request. If you want to create a new one, so if you want to post a new book, you would just do a post. So you would say, okay, I don't need to get any information about a book. I don't want to update existing book. I want to create a completely new book. So you would use post. If you want to update a book, you would use either put or patch. This is exactly what I'm saying. Most of the projects would use put, because that's just what is used. There are some projects that will use patch, especially much larger projects where they need to do the differentiate, where they need to differentiate between put and patch. But patch is not used as much as put. Put basically means you want to update something, and then if you want to,
when you say update, you mean like, for example, change the name or change the size of like one of the criteria of one of the objects.
Yes, exactly. So one of the attributes. So usually you would do if you want to change the title of the book, or if you want to change its price, for example, or something like that, you would do a put, right? You would change it.
Think of it as overwriting.
Yeah. And deleting a book, obviously that's quite self-explanatory. So you could delete a book from the server. Now, as I said, every implementation is different, and there are quite few edge cases where people will be discussing which one of the methods is actually correct to use, especially between post and put. So, for example, if you have an existing book and you want to add an author to it, would you update the book, or would you create a new author on the server? Or like a new author in the instance of the book. So there are different ways to look at this problem, and everybody will have a little bit different implementation, but most of them should be quite consistent. It also depends on what. So people usually look at it also from the point of view of what they're using in the server as a storage. So for example, if you use relational databases like MySQL, then adding an author to a book might be a post, because you would be creating a new author. You would be creating a new record that connects the author to the book. While if you use something like Mongo, like document-based databases, you would usually just update the object of the book with a new author. So you could use put. So a lot of people kind of use their whole implementation of the whole stack to determine which methods to use. But for you, just knowing that put is to update and post is to create and get is to get some information is the most important thing. The most important thing to remember is that get does not have any body, right? So when you send request to the server, what we mean by body is that what the request consists of is the URL that you want to connect to, and then there is more information that goes with the request. With GET request, you have the URL and you have the headers. Those are the two main ones, and that's it, right? So you just say, this is the URL, and give me the data that's behind that URL. You can give it some headers. So for example, if you want the data in a JSON format, you would say, I want it in JSON format. You would control that through the headers. But that's it. In all of the others, post, patch, put, and even delete, you can actually put a body to the request, right? So what that means is you would send a request to the server, which is behind the URL, but also you would give it a bunch of data. You would give it like a blob of data, basically, that is sent with it. So, for example, if you're posting a new book, if you're creating a new book on the server, you would say, this is my URL, which might be, let me just open the editor, which might be something like http library, well, library.com API book, right? So this will be a post request that you would create a new book, for example. In here, as you can see in this URL, there is absolutely no information about what the book is, any title or anything like that. You would add that into the body of this request. So this request would come with a, for example, JSON, and it would be title, hello world, author, and so on and so on and so on. So this would be your JSON that you send to the server. Okay, so this would be your body of the request. For a GET request, yes?
And that's the syntax. Is it post like this in capital letters?
Well, usually we put them in capital letters. I mean, yeah, doesn't really matter. But this is just when if I write it like this is what you would normally see in documentations or logs or something like that.
Right.
If you want to actually make the request, then you would have to do, the syntax would be something like this. Right. So this would be the syntax for fetch. So you would say, this is the URL, and I want to use method post, and then you would say body, and you would put the JSON in there.
Got it.
Okay. So this is how you would actually execute it. Now for get, where you want to just get the information about, when you just want to get everything about the book, you don't actually have any body, right? So you would just say get, and you would have book 99, for example. And this, the only kind of data that you're giving to the server is this number, which is the unique identifier for the book. So you're saying, get me all the data for book number 99. But this request does not have any body. This is all it has, right? So in that case, the fetch would be, let me just move this up here. So in this case, the fetch would be just like this. That's it, because it doesn't have any body. It's just a request. Right?
So when you just put fetch like that, then it's automatically a get.
Yes. So by default, fetch is a get. Yes.
Got it.
If you want to use any other method, you would have to specify it in here.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
Now, you can still use options with the get, but because you might want to do headers, right? So you might want to actually say, okay, I have headers, and my header would be that I want to do accepted format or whatever it's called. I can't remember now. Application JSON, right? So this is basically you sending requests to this URL, which is the server, and in the headers, which is kind of like a parameter, like a metadata for the request, you're saying my accepted format is application JSON. So when it comes back to when the server receives the request, it will look at this header and it will decide how to give you the data. So if you would say application JSON, then it will give it to you in JSON data. If you would say, you know, like for example, I don't know what else could be, what the XML, text XML, then it will give you an XML format. Again, depends on the implementation on the server. Not every server will give you the data in different formats. It depends on the implementation, but this is how would you control it. You could also do something like cache control, for example. So you could say, you know, I'm requesting this data and I want this data for X amount of time to be coming from cache rather than from the server, and so on and so on and so on. So you can control it through headers, basically, these kind of parameters. Now, when I say that get request doesn't have any data, you might argue, what if I want to get all the books, right? So in this case, for example, you would just say API get book, right? I want to get all the books. So you would get, say, 1 million books. What if you want to get just 10 of them? Or what if you want to search through them? Or what if you want to filter them somehow? So get, you can still add parameters. It's not a body because you're not actually supplying something to the server, but you can add parameters, and those are called URL parameters. And the way that they are added is, if in the URL, and you might see it on all sorts of websites, in the, like for example, if I just copy our Meet URL right now, this is the meetup. So you can see the parameter in here. So you can say this is basically telling the server, now I'm starting to give you some kind of parameters, and you can say search, you know, Lord of the Rings, something like this, whatever. So you could do this, and this way you can still give some kind of instructions or some kind of data to the server. But this is not being used, well, at least it shouldn't be used for anything that you want to actually save into the database. Okay, this is only to kind of give some kind of more instructions to the server. Usually you would see something like from 0 to 10 and page 3 or something like that. So this is kind of normal to use for pagination, for example, right?
And can you get any? I'm just wondering, like, can you access any data that you want on websites? So, for example, if you wanted to track, I don't know. No, I'm just like, I don't know, like the number of users on Facebook, for example.
Well,
in a general answer, Thomas, you can just work with whatever content the server makes available to you. In most cases, that sort of information is not available. We're assuming that the information is available, like let's say a public database of movies, for example, then they have an API that you can query against to, but not on servers where the information is private. In most cases, and we will cover that during this course at some point, we need to deal with authorization, and at that point we will simulate, like, okay, let's say I got the credentials to a Facebook thing, then I'm going to send the credentials as part of my query. I need to go through authentication process, but at this point, basically, you can just pull information that is publicly available. It's just a different way of consuming that data.
Got it. Okay, that's the whole concept of API. Okay.
Yes.
Makes sense completely. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. So as Ricardo said, only what the developers actually make available to you. Ricardo already touched on another good example of headers, right? So another header that you might encounter, and you will encounter, is authentication or authorization. So what do you, if you have Facebook or any other project, that will tell you, well, you can use all of these APIs, but you first need to sign up and we give you API key. Then you would have to add it to your header. So you're basically authenticating to the server. You're saying, well, here's the request and it's coming from this API key. And on their side, they will match it to yourself and say, okay, we actually authorize this or not. So what you would do is, again, you would do headers, and you could say, authentication, for example, and it would look something like, something like this. So this would be what you would do even for GET request, for any request really, on a like a authenticated API. So you would actually say, my authentication is this, right? Or authorization, but whatever, they will tell you what header to use. Okay. So this is how would you instruct. You wouldn't put it, this kind of stuff you wouldn't put in the URL, because these things are secret, right? You should not be sharing this with anyone. And if you put it in the URL and then somebody comes along and just copies the URL and gives it to someone else, then they will see your secret key and they can start using your API key. So you need to be careful about your secrets as well. So that's another kind of use case for headers. Now, so this is pretty much it for the fetch. Like, you just need to kind of use it as much as you need to, but it's more important to understand the different methods rather than fetch itself, because fetch is just another function in JavaScript. So as long as you understand that get doesn't have any body, it just gives you some kind of information back. Post, put, and delete, they can have body, even though delete usually doesn't, but they can have body. And you basically sending stuff to the server for server to do something. For post, you're creating new records. For put, you updating them. For delete, you deleting them. Yeah, so that's the kind of most important one. As I wanted to kind of go in more into depth in this, but we got stuck on the promises and stuff. But it is, it's good to understand how the request happens. So how it goes from your client all the way to the server and back. If you think about it, when you load your index.html or when you load your script.js or CSS or anything like that, those are also a requests to the server. So what actually happens when you have your index.html and you do like style ref something blah 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 blah. So what actually happens? The browser will do a fetch on the background automatically, and it will just say, this is my server. So whatever, for example, your local host, and I want to get main.css, and it will do a get request to main CSS, and what it will receive is the plain text of your CSS file, and then it will oh, bye Thomas, and then it will basically parse it in the browser and apply the styles. Yeah. Sorry, Thomas. I don't know if you said something, but
yeah, I'm fine with that, Thomas. Since that is really not specific to JavaScript, so I'm familiar with it. So yeah, I'm good on that. Thank you so much.
I will have a discussion with Vassal, because we didn't go through this basically today and stuff, and I will see if we need to create another session just for this. But it would be good to kind of get you familiar more with what you just said, with the basics of actual making requests and stuff, rather than the fetch itself. The fetch itself is just another JavaScript function. You can easily read documentation for it and start using it. It's not complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, yeah, it's good that you mentioned that you're going to bring this to Vasil, because I've been talking to Vasil. Some previous explanations have not been 100% clear. Like, for example, today we learned about promises and the clarifications on the sync await. We did not get that clear before. So sometimes, yeah, the timing, just make sure that he's aware of this, since Thomas and I already talked to him. On Mondays, we do not really take much of the class.
Okay.
And
well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm really sorry, but I will try to bring it up and see what we can do about it. Always, if you need something, you can ping me, but you will have to. And I think I told you this before. I just don't have that much time to look at the Slack. So if you really need me, just make sure that you notify me. You mention my name. Otherwise, I'm not gonna see it.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm also moving away now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
No worries.
Nice talking to you, Christy.
Thank you.
Enjoy
Bye.
your evening, guys. Bye. Bye. Bye.